Thanks so much for coming, and a very warm welcome to Congress House. It's my great pleasure to host this evening's event. Very grateful to everyone who's come up, but particularly to our honoured guest, Robert Reich. It's a delight for the TUC to be hosting you, Robert, and we're very much looking forward to your lecture. This is the latest in a series of TUC events that we've labelled After Austerity, and while you've been waiting, you'll have seen on the screen some of the past events that we've put on over the last year, and there are some more to come. All of these events have been scrutinising austerity economics and looking at alternatives. We've covered subjects like industrial policy, securing fair pay, and how green growth can rebalance our economy. And there will be others to come in the series. All of these events are part of the TUC's campaign for jobs, growth, and a new economy. We're challenging austerity economics, setting out our alternative, and also looking ahead to the kind of policies and changes we're going to need if we're going to build an economy that's based on sustainable growth and one that actually benefits ordinary people. Our guest today, Robert Reich, has spent decades arguing for just such an economy. Robert is currently the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. He's previously been based at both Harvard and Brandeis universities, and he served as Secretary of Labour in President Clinton's administration. Time magazine named Robert as one of the 10 most effective cabinet secretaries of the last century. And while he was Labour Secretary, he championed policies that directly benefited working people. For example, bringing in a legal right to leave for family and medical reasons, and an increase in the minimum wage. And as I'm sure you'll all know, Robert is the author of landmark works on economic policy, including The Work of Nations, Super Capitalism, and Aftershock. And his latest book, Beyond Outrage, is now out in paperback. And if that weren't enough, he's also got a starring role in a new film about widening US income equality. It's called Inequality for All, and it's just won the 2013 Sundance Festival Special Jury Award, and we're hoping very much we'll get a chance to see that film next year in the UK. Now, Robert's going to speak to us for about 20 minutes, and then he's going to be interviewed by Faisal Islam, who, as you'll all know, is the economics editor of Channel 4 News. And there'll be a chance for all of you to make any points or ask any questions with Faisal in the chair. And take this opportunity to ask you to watch out for Faisal's new book about the economic disaster across Europe. It's called The Default Line, and it's out here in August. Now, some of you might be tweeting tonight's events, and if you are, the hashtag is #AfterAusterity. We'll be winding up about 6:30, and we hope then that you can join us downstairs for some drinks in the Marble Hall. So, Robert, delighted to welcome you to the TUC, and now invite you to take the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Kay. I think I'll stand here rather than behind the podium. As you can see, the economy has worn me down. It's taken a lot out of me. Before 2008, I was about 6'2". I am so pleased to be here. Thank you all for coming out for this. And I also want to thank my host from TUC for inviting me here. The timing is I think, quite fortunate in that the United States has been struggling with so many of the same issues that you've been struggling with here. Economics is a difficult topic to talk about and remain upbeat in the best of circumstances. It is, after all, the dismal science. Many people don't understand or don't realize that before Alfred Marshall's great Principles of Economics in 1890, the topic was not economics per se. It was known in the 19th century as political economy. And the understanding was that you couldn't really talk about economics without talking about politics. It was all interwoven. And here in the UK, as in the United States, economic policy is really about both politics, it's about public policy generally, and the underlying question is how do we create better lives for our people? Which reminds me that in the 18th century, I mean, Adam Smith did not even call himself a political economist. He called himself a moral philosopher. Because in the 18th century, the discipline that we now come to think of as economics was about moral philosophy in the sense of what is the nature of the good? What is a good society? How do we join together and create a good society? What's the meaning of a good society? And I think we've lost that moral rootedness in many of our discussions about economics. Now, I've got to be very careful. Someone coming from the United States especially, or from any other country, and talking to you or a different country and a different society about what is going on in their economy is always kind of in danger of sounding a bit presumptuous, sometimes if the tone is wrong, sounding condescending. Again, I want to emphasize with you that many of the problems you are facing here in the UK are exactly the same as the problems we are facing in the United States. The scale may be different. Some of the policy judgments may be at the margin somewhat different. Many of the mistakes are exactly the same. One big mistake is to assume that the problem originates with the deficit or the cumulative deficit, which is the debt. And in the United States, we have embarked, despite our best intentions, on a form of austerity economics. It's known as the sequester. It is put in place, and I don't want to get into the micro-politics of all of this in terms of who is to blame, but let me just say that government expenditures are being cut, and those cuts are slowing the U.S. economy's recovery. And let me just emphasize this with you, and this is, I understand that this is a hot debate here in the UK, as it continues to be in the United States. The deficit and the cumulative debt are not the underlying problems. Deficit and cumulative debt are symptoms of the underlying problem. The underlying problems have to do with the fact that so many people are unemployed and the median wage keeps dropping. And when you have a lot of unemployment and when you have wages that are dropping adjusted for inflation, then you don't have the wherewithal to maintain government services. You don't have the wherewithal without raising taxes to simply avoid budget deficits. International creditors, domestic creditors start getting a little bit nervous. The worst thing you can do when you have a lot of underutilized capacity, and now I am talking to people who are the descendants intellectually of John Maynard Keynes, your great economist, John Maynard Keynes, not American, British. You know, what Keynes understood was that when you have a lot of underutilized capacity, a lot of unemployment, the biggest problem is on the demand side. There's just not enough aggregate demand to keep the economy going. And under these circumstances, government has got to be the purchaser of last resort. When the private sector, when individuals, consumers, when businesses are not generating enough demand, government has got to be there. Now, I remember my personal experience. My first economics lesson was when I was very, very young. And I remember my father saying to me, now my father was, in those days, a Republican, conservative, and he said to me in very stern language, Bobby, you and your children and your children's children are going to be paying down the debt created by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, I was only 5. I didn't know what a debt was, but I do remember having nightmares about whatever it was and thinking about my children and their children. Well, the fact of the matter is, by the time I was 10 years old, in fact, by the time I was 7, nobody was talking about the debt created by Franklin D. Roosevelt, even though at the time, by the time of the end of the Second World War, that debt, the public debt in the United States was 120% of GDP. By the time my father issued my warning to me, that debt had come down, but it was still very substantial. But nobody talked about the FDR debt by the time I was 7 or 8 or 9. My children have not mentioned it once. I have a 4.5-year-old granddaughter who, in her limited capacity to understand the world, has not talked about FDR's debt. Now, why is it that now, it wasn't that debt itself did not come down in nominal terms. That is, the amount of the GDP that was debt did come down, but the actual amount of debt did not come down. It didn't come down because we had a Cold War, we had a Korean War, the United States rebuilt much of Europe, rebuilt much of Japan. We embarked under Eisenhower on a huge highway building program, major infrastructure investments. It was not that the numerator of that equation, in terms of debt to GDP, it was not that that numerator was reduced. What happened was the denominator, growth. We had very rapid economic growth. And because of that rapid economic growth, that ratio of the debt to the GDP shrunk so much that it no longer became an issue. Growth is the key. And I want to emphasize that one of the great dangers of austerity economics is it slows growth. Or it, as the rest of Europe, it puts an economy into the gravitational pull of a recession. And that worsens the ratio of the debt to the GDP. That's a kind of austerity trap that you want to avoid. Now, people say to me all the time in the United States, and every time I'm talking to anybody from the UK, they say, well, how can we afford? Don't we need to prop up the confidence of international investors, creditors? Aren't we in danger with having a very large debt? Well, there is a danger if there's no growth. There is a danger if you have a lot of unemployment. There's a danger if your real wages, adjusted for inflation, are dropping. Yes, that's the danger. The purpose of your economy, presumably, is not to shrink the debt, per se. The purpose of an economy is to maintain or enhance living standards. And the great danger in the UK, as in the United States, is that you have so many people either unemployed or underemployed. And even those who are employed are facing declining real earnings. That creates an economy that is just not capable of sustaining itself over time. There is another related mythology, that all government spending is the same. That is not the case. There's government spending that is basically designed to maintain living standards today, but then there is a different category of spending which has to do with public investment. Now, any country would be insane not to borrow for the purposes of making public investments if the return on those public investments is greater than the cost of the borrowing. This is, in other words, one of the problems we get into, and that's in the United States as well as in the UK and elsewhere, is that we don't distinguish between investment spending and other kinds of public spending. And in the drive to reduce budget deficits, not only is our focus on the wrong thing, but we tend to sacrifice the very public investments that are necessary to generate future growth. Now, in the United States, for example, we have deferred maintenance on a great deal of infrastructure. That deferred maintenance is slowing the U.S. economy down. At a time when the United States, the yield, on a 10-year Treasury bill in the United States is now very low. It's about 1.2%. The United States can borrow at such a low rate. We have so much long-term unemployment. We have so much deferred maintenance in our infrastructure. It's crazy. It's socially insane not to borrow and put those people to work building and rebuilding infrastructure and generating high future growth. And yet that is not being done because of political gridlock in the United States, as well as public perceptions that somehow the deficit and the debt are the major problems, which, of course, as I said, they are not. Now, a third and related mythology has to do with tax policy. And let me tread very delicately here, because whenever somebody talks about tax policy, people get very sensitive. I have been accused of being a class warrior. I am not a class warrior. I'm a class worrier. You see, there's one letter different. And I worry about widening inequality, which I'll get to in a moment. But we have a third mythology. Again, mythology number one is that the central problem is the deficit and the debt. Mythology number two is that all spending is exactly the same, failure to distinguish between different kinds of government spending and failure to understand the importance of public investment. Mythology number three is the notion that somehow you can't tax the wealthy and you can't tax corporations because they are the job creators. Now, let me make this very, very clear. The wealthy and the corporations are not the job creators. Jobs are created by consumers whose demand generates incentives for companies to make investments and hire. Without adequate demand, and it doesn't have to be only consumers, it can be governments as well. Without adequate demand, there is no incentive to create jobs. So that the job creators are not the wealthy and they are not the big corporations. Right now, today, in fact, in Washington, we have a Senate committee that has been investigating Apple. And the big focus is that Apple has been hiding its profits. Now, the irony here, of course, is that you're having very, very similar discussion about Google and about Amazon and about Starbucks and all of these big corporations. You view them as American corporations. Increasingly in the United States, we're realizing they are not American corporations. They are global corporations without allegiance to any company, any country at all. But the issue is exactly the same in the sense that they're hiding their profits wherever they can find low-cost, low-tax jurisdictions to hide their profits in. It is legal, unfortunately, in the sense that they are finding ways around national laws. National tax laws, and they are doing what corporations do. I mean, after all, a corporation is not established to raise living standards in any particular place around the world. A corporation is not established to generate jobs or public investment. A corporation is established under most of the laws of most capitalist systems to make money for shareholders. But the problem is that corporations are increasingly playing countries off against one another. And the issue is not just tax avoidance with regard to Apple or Google or Amazon. The issue is more fundamental, and that is that every country wants to reduce, or is under pressure or feels under pressure, to reduce corporate taxes overall for fear that somehow national competitiveness is going to be harmed. And again, this is the first cousin to the mythology that corporations mustn't be taxed because they are the job creators. But we have found ourselves in a kind of race to the bottom with regard to taxes, corporate subsidies, corporate welfare, all kinds of other things that every country is providing. It's almost as if our prime ministers and presidents and other heads of state are carnival barkers, and they're saying, oh, come here, global capital, come here, we want you, we'll do this for you, we'll reduce your taxes. This, unfortunately, puts more and more burden on your citizens, on your tax-paying citizens, with regard to everything that needs to be done. And again, we're talking about education, public investment, but also all of the social services that are necessary. So in the United States, as taxes are cut on the wealthy and as taxes are cut on the large corporations, large global corporations, we find that we have less and less revenue to go around. We have to cut budgets to the extent that people are worried about budget deficits, back to mythology number one. But we also are finding that there is greater and greater pressure to cut wages. These global companies, again, are understandably trying to make money. One way of making money is to keep their costs down. One way they can do that is to cut wages. Well, the net result of all of that cutting of wages is, again, full circle, to reduce aggregate demand. This is something that Henry Ford, back in the first decades of the 20th century, understood. He paid his workers twice what the prevailing wage was for automobile workers in those days, knowing that the advantages would come back to him in the form of more people capable of buying Model T Fords. Somehow that understanding has been lost in our corporate sector as these companies become more and more globalized. Finally, let me just point out one other area of mythology that we need to address, it seems to me, if we are going to have a sane discussion about all of this. Many people, unfortunately, have come to view globalization and technological change as inevitably reducing the number of jobs and the quality of the jobs, that is wages. That is sort of there's a kind of economic invariability that comes when people talk about globalization. Globalization, by the way, is one of those words that have gone from obscurity to meaninglessness without any intervening period of coherence. When I'm talking about globalization, I'm talking about basically not just trade, but direct investment, portfolio investment, increasing immigration, cultural integration. And what we have to understand is that ultimately our standard of living, our being in any place on this globe, a group of people called citizens of the United States or the citizens of the United Kingdom, our standard of living depends on the value that we are able to add to this increasingly integrated system of global economics. If we don't add much value because there have not been proper investments made, then we are not going to be able to have high real incomes. That's what it all boils down to. That's why it is so important not to be cutting public investments, not to be cutting very important social services, why it's important to maintain aggregate demand. And also, finally, why inequality is such an insidious problem. In the United States, over the last 30 years, the median wage, adjusted for inflation, has gone almost nowhere at all. In fact, the median wage in the United States, adjusted for inflation today, is almost 8% below what it was in the year 2000. People's standards of living are actually declining. If you assume that inflation is an accurate, we're using the accurate deflator with regard to understanding median wages. But at the same time, almost all of the gains of economic growth have gone to the very top. Now, the problem with regard to widening inequality, and John Maynard Keynes warned of this in his last chapter in the General Theory, is that when you have so much economic gain going to the top, you don't have enough. The middle class and all the people aspiring to join the middle class, they don't have enough income to turn around and buy all of the things that the private sector is capable of producing. And so you have inherently an imbalance in your economy. In the United States, we have a second big problem that comes out of widening inequality, and that is that our democratic system itself becomes undermined. That is, with huge amounts of money at the top, well, that money finds its way into politics in a variety of ways. And that means that you have the very wealthy, through tax policy and other policies, entrenching their wealth and making the entire democratic system look as if it's rigged. And that, in turn, generates a great deal of anger in the population. I mean, why is it that you find right-wing and left-wing parties and movements growing around in Europe, in the United States? Historically, we understand this pattern. When people feel that they're working very hard and they're not getting ahead, when they feel that the system is rigged against them, that anger finds expression and is exploited by demagogues, whether they're on the right or left or wherever they are, and those demagogues who use that anger and use it to channel that anger against scapegoats. And those scapegoats are very often, who are they? We know. Sometimes they're immigrants. In this country right now, and again, I tread very, very carefully because I don't want to accused of either being misunderstood or saying things that suggest that we don't have exactly the same issues. But there is a lot of tension. A lot of people, working class people, middle class people, are worried about immigrants. They're taking away our jobs. They are somehow using our social services and they are making our lives worse. That's the assumption. The reality is very different. The reality is that many of those immigrants, in fact, immigrants, and I can speak from data we have in the United States, immigrants actually are more productive than your native born in the sense that their children are more likely to go to the university, they work longer hours, they have less reliance on social services. Why is that? Because it takes a great deal of ambition to be an immigrant. This is something that we should understand. I mean, in the United States, most of us are the children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren of immigrants. If we look at our own family trees, we see people who endured huge difficulties in terms of getting here. And why did they come here? They came here because of ambition. That ambition is a driving force that actually ultimately helps an economy. It doesn't hurt an economy, it helps an economy. And yet, because of a politics of resentment and a politics that exploits the insecurities of a middle class and a working class that are not getting ahead, those demagogues turn the finger of blame very often against immigrants. So, to summarize, debts and deficits, the economics and the politics of austerity don't work. They are a dangerous they are a dangerous distraction from the underlying problem. And that underlying problem is jobs and wages that are not growing, or they're not generating a solid, stable, and growing middle class. Secondly, trickle-down economics, the idea that the rich and the big corporations cannot be taxed because they're the job creators. Trickle-down economics does not work. We have a lot of evidence accumulated over the years that is not where the job creation comes from. And thirdly, we've got to be very, very careful that we maintain the right balance of public investment and that we generate the quality of life and the possibilities for all our people, including new immigrants, that avoid the politics of anger and the politics of resentment, which we're very, very close to in this country and in the United States. The challenge is in front of us. The good news, in fact, I want to end with a little upbeat note, may I? Because as I think back on what I've said and I look at your faces, it's pretty glum. The good news is that this is not rocket science. That is, we understand, there's enough data, we understand basically what needs to be done. We have to, number one, get a tax policy that is fundamentally fair, in which the corporations and the wealthy are paying a fair share. Number two, we've got to make sure that our financial sectors don't get completely out of control. That's a source of inequality. And I can go on, and Faisal and I hopefully will have an opportunity to get into what we ought to be doing. But the good news is that there are answers. We have, the challenge, it seems to me, is to make sure that the public, the broad public, understands the issues, that the issues are framed properly, that our political classes and our media continue to frame begin to, or I should say continue to, I don't know how badly off the politicians and the media have been here in the United States, but here in the UK, but in the United States, the framing is not really very, very good. The public has been misled continually as to the nature of the problem. But if they understand the nature of the problem, then I think we can get on with what has to be done. And on that upbeat note, I will end. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob.
Faisal?
Okay, should we go there? Thanks. We're just going to have a little 20-minute interview here. And I've set out to confuse the professor by having my hair cut between very sharply between when we last saw each other, which was about 12 hours ago.
We met on a roof.
On the ITN roof. It's a haircut. I was more in need of a haircut than a Cypriot Bond, is my joke.
Yes.
Now,
You're looking very spiffy.
So I think we're going to spend 20 minutes having a chat, and then we're going to open it out to everybody else. And I thought I'd start with some kind of quick fire. Treat this a bit like the sort of Christmas Carol, where we kind of look at the ghosts, present, future, and past. So some quick fire questions on what's going on right now. I think everyone will be wondering what's going, with the macro economy around the world, and then maybe go into a bit of a time machine, because you're an observer now, but you were a participant, and all of the trends that you identify have got roots that go back 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And I wonder if, by looking back at what happened with policy, structural policy in the economy, whether we can learn lessons for the future. So let's just have some quick fire questions on where you see the economy. Let's start with the US. I mean, where, Ben Bernanke seems to be quite upbeat about where the US economy is going. Do you feel that there's a enduring recovery firing up in your own home country?
I think the economy, the recovery is very fragile in the United States.
Yeah.
It is being empowered by Ben Bernanke and the Fed,
Yeah.
Keeping interest rates very low,
Yeah.
buying up long-term bonds
Yeah.
and mortgage bonds and so forth. But that can't continue forever. And that is aggravating inequality, because a lot of that money is migrating to the stock market. And the top 10%, the richest 10% of Americans own 90% of the shares of stock in America. And that is having a short-term positive impact, but it's not an enduring impact. And again, what I tried to get across here is that if you don't have a growing middle class, and if your median wage adjusted for inflation keeps on dropping, then you don't really have an opportunity to get to have a sustainable, get on a sustainable growth path.
And then just quickly on Europe, as an outsider, when you look in on the Eurozone, that's clearly impacting upon our own growth prospects here in Britain. How do you see the Euro crisis as an outsider? There seems to be an unspoken American critique of, for example, the role of Germany, feet dragging, not kind of firing silver bullets to get the Euro crisis solved.
Americans keep on looking at Europe, and we're amazed that the crisis, A, doesn't go away, but never turns into a real crisis. That is, it's kind of
zombie.
It's kind of
neither dead nor...
That's right. Yeah. It's just, everybody keeps on kicking the can down the road, everything is delayed and nothing is decided, but it still keeps on getting slightly worse. I mean, much of Europe is going into recession right now.
Yeah.
But the underlying problem of the euro, at least from an American perspective, is that you've got different economies that really should be operating in many respects differently, and would be operating differently, but the euro is undervalued with regard to part of Europe, and overvalued with regard to another part of Europe. I mean, if Southern Europe had its own currency, and I'm not suggesting this, but if Southern Europe had its own currency, that currency would have been devalued long before now. And Northern Europe's currency would have appreciated. And so you have a kind of a structural imbalance in the euro itself that is aggravated by an inability to discipline fiscal policy. You have centralized monetary policy and a fiscal policy that is very, very difficult to organize. And then on top of that, obviously, you have less labor market mobility than was assumed when the euro was put together. So you have a system that is very awkwardly arranged. I'm not in any way suggesting that the euro should end, or that the eurozone is doomed. But it's got to deal with these structural problems.
And then lastly, Britain, obviously, other parts of the world as well to consider, but let's consider Britain. I mean, is it really your perspective here that the flat growth, essentially, that we've seen over the past 2 or 3 years is a consequence of government policy, or is it not just the consequence of having to deal with the aftermath of, per capita, possibly the biggest credit bubble that the world's ever seen?
Look, I should have perhaps started with this. I mean, when you have a very deep recession, you expect rapid economic growth to get back to your trend line. In 1933, 1934, 1935, 1936, we had in the United States economic growth that was 7, 8, 12% per year. And that kind of growth was almost a natural accompaniment of how far down the economy had gone. And so the fact that our growth rates in the United States were having, I would say, probably this year, an annualized growth rate of about a little over 2%. That's nothing to be happy about. I mean, that's a very disturbingly slow growth, 4.5 years out of a recession that was as deep as the Great Recession.
So in the UK, just to pin you down here, are you saying that the austerity policy has means that this government has lost an opportunity to plan longer term for economic change, or are you saying it's directly caused the stagnation that we've seen in Britain?
I think the austerity policies that you have embarked on are harming growth. They're a drag on economic growth. That they harm the long term and also are harming short term.
Okay, let's go back in time, because you were US Labour Secretary in the 90s, and when I hear you talk about declining median wages, part of that, or certainly they didn't grow under your watch. It was
They did. Actually, they only grew under my watch.
Oh, right. If you take it...
It's a peculiar thing.
It depends which deflator you use, doesn't it?
No. There is a special Bill Clinton deflator. But quite seriously, if you look at the reason the median wage increased, and that was the only era of time in the late 90s under Bill Clinton, was because unemployment was so low. When you get unemployment down to around 4%, 4.5%, employers are so desperate to find people that they're willing to pay wages that are substantially much higher. And that's true of employers even with regard to people who are relatively unskilled. And so you began to see in the late 90s something that we were not seeing in the 80s, early 90s, we haven't seen since. And that is a labor market that was so tight that it started to generate higher real wages. But that was only about 3 or 4 years. And then I left my post as Labour Secretary, and everything fell apart.
And people started having to live on less. Okay then, but then the seeds of some of what contributed to that decline in median wages were negotiated under your watch. To be controversial, it was the Clinton administration that, for example, acceded in China's wish to join the World Trade Organization. That had amazing impact on growing the world economy, but no one can doubt right now that it's had an impact on certain types of labour in the West, in Britain and Europe. I mean, I was really struck by hearing the U.S. Trade Representative, Ron Kirk, I think he may have changed now, at Davos, and he said the following. He said, we have to watch out, because the presumption that free trade helps everybody is no longer just assumed in America. People don't think because you get a cheap iPad, I'm willing to trade my job, or I'm willing to get trade my job elsewhere. Do you think that there were some ways in which China was brought into the world economy which had deleterious impacts to people in America and Europe, and which should have been done differently?
Well, let's put it this way. globalization, rapid globalization, of which ascension to WTO by China is one example. The North American Free Trade Act, also negotiated under Bill Clinton, is another example. When you go to globalize very rapidly, there is going to be a portion of your workforce, particularly your relatively lower skilled, particularly your manufacturing workforce, that is going to bear disproportionately the burdens of globalization. The beneficiaries are going to be better skilled, they're going to be your professional classes, they're going to be people who really face a larger market for the services that they can provide. And unless there are means of compensating the losers by the winners, and because the winners could still come out ahead, given the magnitude of the gains, you're going to generate widening inequality.
So this has been the story. This is where I'm quite intrigued as to what's happening right now. This has been the story, it was a story in Clinton America, it was a story under Blair here, that if you educate people and train them up, they can go from the low-skilled jobs and take those high-skilled jobs where they're not being outcompeted by the Chinese and everybody else. But it strikes me that right now, you have the opposite happening. You have people in the middle sort of being sucked down into the low-skill pot, which is extremely competitive, horrible risks being taken, wages declining, all sorts of insecurity. And so it's like the absolute opposite, if you like, of the great Clinton-Blair third way settlement is beginning to emerge.
Well, because the third way, if you wanted to call it the Clinton-Blair third way, was premised on not just education, but it was premised on public investment in infrastructure and basic research and development and in adjustment mechanisms that never really were funded. At least they weren't funded in the United States. I don't know about the UK. I mean, one of the things that Bill Clinton wanted to do, and I and others were pushing very hard for, was moving from an unemployment insurance system that was designed for a time when most people, if they lost their jobs, only lost it briefly during a recession, and then they get the same old job back again. Moving from that to a re-employment system that would recognize that most people never get the old job back again, that they need income support while they get new skills, they need job counseling, they may need help in moving physically from one location to another location, because the places where jobs are disappearing, often the property values drop, and the places where jobs are increasing, those property values are increasing, and so it's hard to move. So without that adjustment mechanism in place, just better education is not going to do nearly enough.
Who's getting this right? Best practice around the world. I mean, everyone is obsessed with Germany and trying to kind of adopt the German model wholesale.
I don't think anybody's got it all right entirely. What Germany has done, which I think is very important, Germany still has at least some residue of corporatist bargaining. I mean, that is national bargaining over wages and working conditions. It's not what it used to be. The top 1% in Germany is still taking home about 11-12% of total income. Unlike in the United States, the top 1% is taking home more than 20% of total income. In Germany, you still have a vocational technical route for many young people that generates people very proficient in skilled precision manufacturing. And so you still have manufacturing exports based upon very high skills.
But the policy that they boast about in Berlin is that they have reduced wages, they've reduced unit labour costs, they've become more efficient, and now, not just as that worked for Germany, they're going to try and export that throughout the crisis-ridden southern Eurozone. I mean, it seems to be that, I know what you're saying, but the direction of travel in Germany, which is held up as a very successful example for us all, seems to be workers accept lower pay.
Well, I think Germany says one thing to the rest of the world, particularly to the Eurozone, and does something slightly differently. I'm not accusing you of hypocrisy, but I think that there are institutions in place in Germany that continue to achieve relatively high real wages and a higher degree of job security and the kind of national bargaining that I was mentioning a moment ago, that Germany does not talk about a great deal. I mean, Germany would rather talk about flexible labor markets, but the labor market, actually, if you look very closely, has intrinsic in it the capacities to make, for want of a better term, let's call it industrial policy. I haven't used the term industrial policy so far today, but I think that ultimately we do need to face a certain critical set of facts, and that is that inevitably nations have industrial policies. There's certain sectors that are going to be favored because the underlying cost structures are different from other sectors. And even seemingly neutral laws with regard to taxes, antitrust, other forms of regulation are going to affect sectors differently. So the real question is not, do you have an industrial policy or do you not? The question is your industrial policy focused in a way of easing adjustment to higher value-added work and higher value-added sectors?
Let me put this to you. I do wonder if in this country the trouble governments seem to have with industrial policy seems to be a slightly dirty word, or certainly has been. Maybe that's changing a little bit now. And I wonder if that's rooted in economics. You know, economics seems to invite you to imagine you don't need to intervene anywhere. It was the Chicago Consensus. You were involved in that those arguments in economics faculties in the States.
They go on forever. Well, I mean, the economics as a discipline, is basically either microeconomics, which is a set of theories in search of reality, or it's macroeconomics, which has completely fallen apart post 2008. I mean, Alan Greenspan saying, "Well, I must have been mistaken. Sorry." You have an intellectual edifice that is very important and very useful for certain purposes. But when you're planning an economy, you don't want to take it more seriously than it deserves. I mean, as I said before, politics and economics are inextricably interrelated. You cannot have a market unless there are political, governmental decisions as to what the rules of that market are going to be. There is no market in a state of nature. And the Supreme Court of the United States right now is making a very important set of decisions about whether you can patent the genome. Well, if that is not government deciding what is property and thereby having a fundamental effect on the trajectory of development, I don't know what is.
And just lastly, before we bring everyone else in, let us into why it is in America. And you see an echo of this in Britain. You saw the most violent eruption in our financial markets in 2008, and yet if you like, the gains politically from that collapse here and in America didn't sort of go to the left, organised labour, people that have been warning about dangers lurking in banking systems, financial systems, the dangers of inequality. It seems, if anything, the opposite is true. Do you buy into that? Why would you say that that's
well, I think it was the unintended consequence of actually preventing the financial crisis from becoming a Great Depression. In other words, the United States and other governments did just enough to prevent a crisis from becoming a devastating, kind of annihilating economic catastrophe. But by doing that, they, ironically, prevented the formation of political demands for fundamental reform of the system. So right now in the United States, you have the biggest banks, bigger than they were in 2008, doing much of what they were doing leading up to 2008. I mean, J.P. Morgan Chase with their London whale $6 billion losses. I mean, that didn't come out of no place. That came out of the same culture, the same practices that were leading up to 2008. You still in the United States don't have a resurrection of what we call the Glass-Steagall Act or any kind of separation of commercial from investment banking, even though the Volcker Rule, which we called it, from Paul Volcker's idea, which was a compromise between resurrecting Glass-Steagall and doing what Wall Street wanted, is not itself, even itself, has not become the law of the land because Wall Street has been so powerful and has delayed the entire process. So it's a combination. Let me just restate that. It's a combination of the crisis not being big enough to get public demands for fundamental reform, and also your political system being responsive, overly responsive in my view, to Wall Street, to the financial sector.
Okay, we know about that. Thanks for that. Okay, let's bring in some people Who wants to ask a couple of questions? So we'll take like 3 at a time. If you could identify yourself. Have we got a mic? Okay, that's great. So there's 3 people down here. The gentleman in the blue shirt, the red shirt, and the guy in the tie over there.
Hello, yes, Robert. So I wanted to ask an opinion on here we are in the TUC, the trade union in Congress, and we've got wages squeezed and we've got prices going up and consumers squeezed. The trade unions focus on worker power. Shouldn't we be focusing on consumer power so that consumers buy together instead of being sold to? It's something which I've called a compopoly in a book I've written, but is that a workable solution in your opinion?
Thanks. We'll just take a couple at a time, yeah. Just next.
Yeah, my name is Daniel Benami and I'm a freelance journalist. I just wanted to ask you about your first myth, which I completely take your point about debt and deficits being a symptom of an underlying problem and not the problem itself. But couldn't you say the same about jobs and unemployment, which clearly are real problems to people? But couldn't you argue that they're also symptoms of more fundamental economic forces? And I should emphasise, I'm not asking this from a conservative perspective, but just from an analytical point of view. Couldn't you say there's some deeper rot in the economy, which is really something that has to be tackled?
Thanks for that. And just the gentleman with the tie.
Your discussion focused on the problem of the myth of the deficit being the starting point. A lot of the political rhetoric around these issues, though, is about the appropriate size of government in total and what it should most legitimately do. You have this debate in the US, particularly prominently. Here, it's slightly more subdued part of the discussion, I would say. But do you have a view about where, in the scheme of things currently in Western countries, an appropriate level of public as opposed to private activity should be pitched? Does it matter in this discussion?
Well, let me try to respond to all 3 comments if I can remember them.
So consumer power.
And they are all interrelated. They are all interrelated.
Oh, wow.
I'm sorry?
Yes, sorry. I couldn't interrelate them, but you're obviously a narrative wordsmith. So there was consumer power, there was deficits and debt symptoms, and there was the size of the state.
Yeah, well, they're interrelated in the following way. That many people who are professing, and in the United States it's mostly the Republican Party, it's House Republicans, the Tea Partiers, they profess to be concerned about budget deficits. But when they are pressed on the deficit front, and they are kind of challenged. They say, well, will you raise taxes, even on the wealthiest, or will you close tax loopholes for the sake of reducing the budget deficit? They say, heavens no, because what we really mean, sotto voce, is we want a small government. And that debate over the size of government is one that we've had in the United States, certainly since 1933, and it never ends. I mean, it never ends, and it can't end for the reasons that we were talking about a moment ago, that government defines the markets. Government is designing markets. And as you get into more and more high technology, and this goes to questions of not only kind of national, what is the meaning of a nation, and also bargaining, who's doing the bargaining? Is it consumers or unions? As you move in that direction, it becomes even more evident that government has got to be the bargaining agent for your nation's workers in a system of global capital. And this, incidentally, is something that I'm surprised here that I don't hear more about. I mean, people are now talking, oh, well, we're not sure, we want to have a referendum on EU because we're afraid most people are going to say, no, we ought to get out of the EU. This is exactly the same time that this debate about global capital is going on, and big corporations hiding their money in various tax-sheltered places. Well, the advantage of Britain being part of the EU, potentially one of the big advantages, going back to bargaining, is that Britain and the EU have a much greater potential bargaining power vis-a-vis global capital than does Britain alone.
There's a bit of a counsel of despair on this, isn't there? I mean, that you just can't, they'll always find a way not to pay their taxes. They'll always find another tax haven. They can't. particularly when you have intangible assets like with Apple and with say the tech companies, they seem to be putting their IP in various countries and renting it back, and that seems a very difficult thing to actually hammer down.
Well, no,
You think it's a matter of will? You think it's a matter of political?
It shouldn't be difficult. It's a matter of political will. It shouldn't be difficult at all. I mean, Apple has a certain amount of sales in the UK.
Yeah.
I mean, is that difficult to?
Apparently so.
Well, yes, apparently so, but it really is not that difficult. I mean, the underlying problem is politics. And the underlying problem is the power of global capital, because in the background you've got global capital that is saying, "Oh heavens, if you crack down on us, Britain is going to be less competitive." Whatever competitiveness means, we don't know what it means. What it should mean is the standard of living of people here in this place called the UK, Great Britain, and is the standard of living going up, or is it not going up? And that depends on a certain kind of organization of your economy and certain kinds of investments. But in order to get that organization, in order to get those investments, you need some bargaining leverage with regard to global capital. And this gets to the question about unions and consumers. I'm sorry. I think that the trade union movement is still extremely relevant, particularly for low-wage workers in the personal service sectors of our economies. Retail chains, restaurant chains, hospital chains, hotel chains. I mean, you've got in the United States the fastest-growing sectors of your labor force and job growth is in these personal service sectors that are immune from international competition. They don't have to worry about low-wage workers in Southeast Asia, and you are also immune from labor-saving technologies because the essence of what you're providing is personal service. That's not something a computer can give by definition. Personal service, and so there's no excuse for not giving these people more bargaining leverage with regard to unions. As consumers, your point, the way you get more bargaining leverage is through joining together Britain, the EU, as part of the EU, and saying essentially to global capital, if you don't act responsibly, if you don't pay taxes, if you don't get us out of this race to the bottom, we don't have to do business with you. We can do business with your competitors.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions. Let's take some questions on this side. Just the gentleman next to you, and the lady there, and the gentleman here. Sorry, just your name.
Robert Reich from London School of Economics. Do you see a feasible path for reform of the financing of political parties? Do you see this as a really important step in order to reduce the hold of global capital on national governments? And what would you suggest by way of a feasible path for reforming the financing of political parties?
Just pass the microphone 4 down to there. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Christine Lewis from Unison, a public service union. I wanted to ask your opinion on how you think we can incentivise young people who are not engaged in education and training, preparing them for the labour market or whatever, on the back of really a conditional cash transfer scheme that we had in this country until change of government, which gave young people money to stay in school and education and training past compulsory age. And I think you have a similar scheme in America that Harvard has evaluated. So I just wondered what you thought about this sort of incentivisation.
And just the gentleman at the front. There's a just.
Yeah, I'm struck by. Thank you.
Oh.
Philip Connolly from Royal National Institute of Blind People. I'm struck by this kind of separation of people as on the supply and demand side, that people are seen as kind of on one side only, and that they're seen as therefore an imposition on business and a cost to business, rather than as part of the solution and part of the way of, and so I'd like to be interested in actually how do we turn this supply and demand of labour into more of a revolving door where people are assisted to become the solutions to their own unemployment situation, and especially for the disabled.
Okay, let me take those questions again in turn. With regard to with regard to the power that companies, particularly global companies, have over governments, it seems to me that a great deal of effort needs to be put into campaign finance reform in the United States. You don't have the same problems here that we have in the United States. But it's not just campaign finance reform, it's also ending the revolving door, reducing the likelihood that officials in government are going to then go into the very industries that they're regulating or take director positions or in some way exploit their public service, because that sends up creates ulterior motives, or at least the appearance of conflicts of interest when they are in public service. I think it's terribly important that we keep money and even the lure of lots of money with and particular jobs separate from our democracies. You do it through laws, but then you get into a kind of chicken and egg problem. That is, how do you create the laws to begin with if you're dominated by money, and much of that money is coming from big corporations and from financial firms. What our experience in the United States is that there are windows of opportunity to have genuine reforms. And those windows of opportunity usually follow scandals. The public is focused, as they were after, for example, Watergate. We had a slew of campaign finance reforms and revolving door reforms after Watergate that lasted for a certain number of years. Unfortunately, then you get some erosion. We also have a Supreme Court in the United States that unfortunately believes that corporations are people, at least for the purposes of the First Amendment, and lower courts have interpreted that Citizens United case to open the floodgates to money in politics. So in the unique case of the United States, we may have to have a constitutional amendment. But let me just assure you that when the broad base of the citizens in America, and I suspect in the UK as well, understand or are in any other way informed about the extent of big money in politics eroding their democracy, people can get very agitated and can support reform. Again, it's a never-ending challenge, but there are periods where reform really does occur. Second question with regard to keeping young people in school, what we found in the United States is in periods of high unemployment and high youth unemployment, the opportunity cost for young people to continue their education is not nearly as great, because they don't have jobs out there, and so that they also see that the returns to education are quite substantial in terms of one's lifetime earnings. The biggest problem we have in the United States is different from what you have, and that is that the cost of higher education keeps rising much faster than inflation.
We've got that here too.
You have that here too, unfortunately. And so even though the return on higher education or extended education beyond compulsory education is very large, nevertheless, it is declining given the increasing costs of higher education. And that's what I worry about. Many of my students, for example, leave college or leave university with a great deal of student debt they have to pay off in a very difficult job market. And rather than be going to social services or be defense attorneys for the indigent or do a lot of other things that might have a great social value, they feel compelled to go into lines of work where they have a reasonable assurance of paying off their student debts. And I'm sorry, the third question, your question...
About separating out supply and demand and putting labour only on one side of the
Yes.
equation.
With regard to companies regarding their workers as assets to be developed as opposed to costs to be cut, I think that, at least in the U.S. labor market, there's a very, very sharp demarcation between what companies regard as fungible workers. That is, we're going to cut their jobs, their benefits, their wages, because we can get other people to do those same jobs in other countries, or we can outsource. We can make these basically temporary jobs or contingent jobs, and we'll get exactly what we would get. We're getting for a higher price from our permanent employees. A big distinction between how companies regard those fungible workers on the one hand, and how they regard the so-called quote-unquote talent on the other hand, where they say, oh, we must match the highest bid for these professional, talented workers. Otherwise, how are we going to stay competitive? And I think that kind of disjuncture between the talent and the fungible worker has grown dramatically over time, and I think it's basically wrong. The best-run companies in the United States, and I wish that investors began understanding the data better, because if they did, they would put pressure on companies. The best-run companies are companies that are treating all of their workers as assets to be developed rather than as costs to be cut. They are continuously upgrading and reskilling their workers. They understand the costs, and they are very substantial costs of losing workers and then having to recruit and hire replacements, and they understand the importance of keeping together a workforce that really, where there is a kind of social capital that is developed over time.
I just wondered, at Berkeley, is that LA or San Francisco?
I can't believe you're asking
No,
that
sorry, no. I don't know. I suddenly had a doubt in my mind.
No. Berkeley is a suburb of San Francisco.
Oh yes, no. I thought it was San Francisco. Then suddenly a little doubt popped in my head. I said, no, Faisal, it's LA. It's LA.
No, that's
okay. So
that's
San Francisco,
UCLA.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So has that changed your perception on this? Because in San Francisco, just a stone's throw away from you, or maybe a bit more than a throw, but you have Silicon Valley, which is this kind of cutting edge, redefining the company, redefining technology, the most cutting edge scientists in the world making squillions from their ideas developed as a 15-year-old, and yet you also obviously have a lot of low wage, unskilled poverty around San Francisco. I just find it's an astonishing experiment in what you're describing.
It's a dramatic experiment in what I'm describing. I mean, I sit down with executives from Google and Apple and Facebook, and they're all there, and Oracle. I mean, every major company except Microsoft is right there within 5 miles of where I live. And I say to them, now, don't you feel that it is in your interest to invest in the educational system of California, the infrastructure, the roads and the bridges? I mean, don't you need to have a first-class kind of context, environment in which to build your firm? And they say to me, no. We can get the best workers we want anywhere around the world.
So isn't that, I mean, your utopian vision of getting companies and global capital accountable to the state, to global national power, international political power, if it's not working in San Francisco, how's it going to work across the world?
But that's exactly my point.
Okay.
We cannot assume corporate social responsibility.
Okay.
We cannot assume it's in the interest of companies like Apple to be interested in the welfare and the well-being of California and make investments in and of their own accord.
Yeah.
It will only happen if we understand that Apple is a global company, that it's major, it has no real allegiance to any place called the United States or the UK or any place else. And if access to the market is conditioned on it doing A, B, C, and D.
But it's up to politicians to decide to change or enforce the social contract.
It's up to politicians to articulate the social contract. It's up to politics and law. It has to be sanctified in law to generate and to actualize that social contract. It is very important, as we talked about a moment ago, that the political impacts, the political kind of effects of wealth of global capital be minimized on the democratic process. And it's important that politicians and the public understand why, why all this is necessary.
You'll listen to some more questions, or I'll start inflicting you questions from Twitter. Okay, let's go to the back. Take it from the back. The gentleman there, and then the guy across the...
Hi, Robert. Mike Roberts. I think both yourself and Paul Krugman seem to be singing from the same hymn sheet. We in Europe and also this country have a problem of, I think, failure of what I would call the left political elite to actually get a grip in relationship to leadership role. Do you think that, as many of us are at the moment, very frustrated about the timidity of the left in both Europe and the UK to actually articulate the views that you have and Paul Krugman has?
Just with the glasses, yes. Just thank you.
My name is Ed Rosen. I was very impressed with what your father said to you many years ago. Could you try and describe the world in which your granddaughter will reach adulthood?
And then just to the left of you, yeah, just in the row in front.
Thank you. Michael Connarty, a Member of Parliament, a member of the European Scrutiny Committee. I had the pleasure, Robert, to actually hear you speak the day you were made the Employment Secretary for Employment by Clinton. I was at the induction of the Congress at that time. Now, you've talked about austerity versus growth. I was with Olli Rehn and Van Rompuy last Monday, who are arguing for their the only plan, they say, for Europe, which is in fact rigid austerity for those countries who don't come up to their standards, which are Northern European standards, which seems to me to be an absolute straitjacket for the countries. And they're talking about contracts with penalties written in. I mean, how do we find the arguments? Because I understand that the G7, our government and others at the G7 were applauding that as the way forward for Europe.
Three great questions.
Yeah, all of your questions are great questions, and they require, each of them requires much more time to respond than we have. So you will, I hope, excuse me for my truncated responses. Question number one, I think, was about the left in Britain and the EU, failing to articulate an economic critique of austerity and so on. I can only say that in the United States, and I can't speak for Paul Krugman or for Joe Stiglitz or for anybody else, but I can speak for myself, even though I was a cabinet minister and am still close to many of the people who advise President Obama. I have my days of feeling absolute, unadulterated frustration. That there is no way of getting through. Now, austerity has not been the project it has been in Europe, but we are not making the public investments we need to make, and we're not taking widening inequality nearly as seriously as we should, and stagnating and declining real median wages is a huge, huge issue that nobody's paying attention to. So it's easy to talk. It's easy to appear on television and to write articles and op-eds. Very hard to actually break in to the political discussion in a meaningful way in the United States. So please don't assume that simply because there are a few of us who may be louder than some people on the left here, that it has very much consequence. The second question, remind me.
Yes, second question. Let's do that third, because that's a very lyrical question. It's the granddaughter. But let's just take let's take the European question first. The one about the argument on austerity across the Eurozone being put forward from our politician. Yeah.
Well, the argument for austerity, I think begins obviously with Greece, and but the failure to see that Greece is really a special case. I mean, Britain is not Greece, and the failure to see that capital markets will recognize the distinction, I think is a very, very fundamental failure. In the United States, increasingly, and it's not just Paul Krugman and Joe Stiglitz and I, it's a large number of policy analysts and economists are using the example of Britain with American politicians and the American public to say, look what happens when you don't really have to embark upon austerity. When you do, in terms of the consequences for your economy. And a lot of people in America are looking at Britain and saying, well, why in the world did you go down this road? I mean, what possessed you?
Just so I played an independent journalist here. What would you have done with a 10 to 12% deficit, inheriting that in 2000?
Well, you know, what you do is you say economic growth, jobs, wages, and growth are the central focus of our economy, and you know, we are going to do everything we can to get more jobs, to get better wages, and faster growth. And if we do that, the deficit will take care of itself. I mean, why would you work on the tail of the dog rather than the dog? And it seems to me that that's. But again, I don't want to sound presumptuous because we have the same problem, not quite to the extent, but we have the same problem in the United States. We have plenty of politicians, and much of the public thinks that the deficit and the debt are huge issues. I should also say that a couple of years ago in the United States, the deficit was, as a percentage of GDP, very, very high. Now the deficit is down to about 5% of GDP, not because we, I mean, it wasn't this huge cost-cutting. The cost-cutting just started a couple of months ago. It was because the economy slowly but surely has started to grow, and taxes have been increased, marginal taxes on the wealthy.
America is in a unique position, though, with its role in the world economy, of being able to sustain larger deficits and with the Chinese
but the arguments, you say that, but the arguments are exactly the same among the deficit hawks. And one of the big mistakes that President Obama made was to legitimize the deficit hawks early on by appointing a deficit commission and by freezing pay of federal workers and saying, oh, well, the deficit is a huge problem. And that legitimized the voices on the right that were saying, we've got to do something about the deficit.
Okay,
now, just one final point. The deficit is projected to go down to 4% of GDP by the end of this year. Yeah. Now, when the Clinton administration began in 1992, the deficit was 5% of GDP. So, but we still have people who are claiming that the deficit is the problem.
So, what would you say to your granddaughter as you were told?
Oh, I would say that my granddaughter, if nothing changes in the United States, if all of the trends remain exactly as they are right now, she is going to be fine. You know, but she's going to be fine because her father, my son, is a professor at Columbia. You know, she is going to get all the benefits of being on the right side of the Great Divide. She's going to have a very good education, and her parents are prepared to, you know, although a professor's salary is not gigantic, but they're going to make the sacrifices necessary. From the time she was, you know, a day old, everybody was talking to her, stimulating the little brain, and playing music and doing everything else you do. So she is going to do fine, but she's going to be growing up if nothing else is done in an economy and a society in which the divide is going to be much darker than it is today.
So you're not one of these people that would say to your granddaughter, learn Mandarin, learn German in our context.
Well, yes, but I don't even have to tell her because
she already
knows Mandarin. The other.
So how old is she?
Yeah, She's 4.5 going on 18. But the other point that needs to be made when we're talking about inequality is that the rich in the UK, in the United States, elsewhere in developed nations would do better with a smaller share of a rapidly growing economy and one in which that was not ridden by social strife than they're doing with a very large share of an economy that is barely growing at all, and where divisiveness and social instability is very threatening.
Now, this is the message of your film, isn't it? Is this basically you trying to get into the brainwaves of America's 1% and tell them that they're, you know, that this thing isn't working for them, even if they
yes, well, the
perceive
theme,
the
the name of the film is Inequality for All, and the basic idea of the film is that we are perilously close to a degree of inequality that is actually hurting everyone.
And so it hasn't started showing. It showed at the Sundance at the film festival, but it's going to go on release in September.
I know nothing about the film industry.
Okay,
I got into this completely unwittingly by accident, but it is kind of an inconvenient truth about the economy, and I do play the Al Gore role.
Have you consulted with the Vice President about
no,
about how to play that role?
I haven't, and I obviously since he got the Academy Award and the Nobel Peace Prize, my ambitions are quite large.
Did you guys get on? Did you guys get on? Did you get on?
Yes. Except that when he ran for president in 2000, in the Democratic primary, I supported Bill Bradley.
Right.
Which, I don't know how many of you are politicians. Those of you in politics know that when you do anything that's slightly disloyal, grudges do occur. But I think we're fine now.
Great. Okay, let's take a couple of last questions. As we're getting to the end of the evening, let's try and make them reflective and light, but that's a hope. Lady with the yellow jacket and the person in front of you as well.
Hi, my name's Daisy. I'm from the Fawcett Society. We campaign for women's equality, but my question's actually much broader in terms of the limitations of growth. Obviously, we talk about growth as the aspiration in our economy, and that sounds very sensible, be it 2% or 12% or what have you. But where are the limitations in that on a planet that has limited resources and in an ever-crowded space and with an agenda of climate chaos encroaching upon us?
Just pass the microphone in front of you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Claire Pelham from Leonard Cheshire. We're a charity that supports disabled people, and I do a lot of work with employers about encouraging them to have a more diverse workforce. And I wondered if, as I'm often asked in a lift, give me 2 sentences why I should employ more disabled people, how you'd answer that question.
Should we take those two?
Oh, we're just saying two?
Yeah.
All right. Question number one. With regard to growth and economic growth, I think it's very important to draw a distinction between consumerism, growth that is simply more stuff, and growth that actually enables a country to do any number of things, including improve its environment, improve public health, provide better education. It's not an accident that the richest nations are also the cleanest in terms of their environments, because you see, growth is not just about consumer goods. It's about productive capacity to do all kinds of things. You and I might hope, now that's a political decision. I mean, I would say, in terms of my values, I would use more of growth to achieve these public purposes, to clean the environment, to generate greater public health, to improve education, to improve infrastructure, and so forth. But there's nothing inherent about growth that means either more goods, public goods, or more private goods. Growth is about the capacity to make these choices. And I'm with you. If it were only about more private expenditures that have to do with stuff that is using up scarce resources and polluting the environment, or sending more CO2 to the environment, I mean, who wants that's not sustainable. The second question about what would you say to employers about hiring disabled people? I would say to employers, and I would use a lot of the empirical evidence we have, and you must have access to it all, that simply because somebody is disabled doesn't mean they are not productive. In fact, in many respects, I have seen with my own eyes, and the data show, a lot of disabled people actually being more productive than people who don't have those disabilities for certain kinds of jobs. And employers need to understand those data, and it's in the employer's interest.
Okay, the title of this series is After Austerity, Where Next for the UK Economy. I was very struck about, maybe you can explain to the audience, about something that happened during the election in America, which is one of the reasons that President Obama was credited and he was voted back into the White House was the bailout of GM. It's quite a remarkable event in a way. The actual bailout, when you think that GM kind of defined a certain type of shareholder capitalism, developed measures of shareholder capitalism, developed modern marketing and manufacturing methods. The idea that that was bailed out, one, and then two, in America, the architect of that bailout was re-elected partly on the back of that, suggestive of a different role for the state in the economy, even in America. And whether after austerity, this different role for the state, whether you see that developing, whether that's the answer, even though the politics doesn't seem to be getting there right now.
Well, it's a good question. I think that the president gained credibility from the GM bailout because GM became, after the bailout, a viable entity and continued to hire and continued to expand. But it is important to understand that the entering salary of GM workers is approximately half what it was adjusted for inflation 20 years ago. And so those are not any longer great jobs. They're important because they have a lot of external effects. They have a multiplier effect in the region, and a region that has been very hard hit. So they are important jobs from a kind of sociological standpoint and from a broader economic standpoint, but the jobs themselves are not that great. I would say the greater danger from the bailout came from the bailout of Wall Street. But not only moral hazard, but also the notion, the cynicism that came out of that bailout, that we have socialism for the very, very wealthy and a harsh capitalism for everybody else. And I think the Tea Party movement, that is the right-wing Tea Party movement, and the Occupier movement, both came out of the Wall Street bailout. I mean, they both came out of this deep cynicism about the relationship between government and finance and government and business. One became Tea Partiers because they said inherently government is going to be bought off by finance and by the big players. The others, the occupiers, felt that we had to get Wall Street out of government in order to have government functioning. But the discontent is still there, and it's very, very deep.
Occupy versus Tea Party would make a great reality TV show. I'm thinking. So lastly, where next for the UK economy then? Will it be after austerity? I mean, the IMF's in town tomorrow. They're going to give a bit of unsolicited advice to the Chancellor, I understand. But are we going to be after austerity anytime soon? And if so, where next for the UK economy?
Look, I think it's significant that the IMF is advising the UK to slow down on austerity. The IMF is not, generally speaking, I mean, it's quite a conservative organization. The IMF has been, we're not talking about a bunch of radicals here. I mean, for the IMF to actually say, wait a minute, you're overdoing it, I think ought to be sobering, hopefully sobering to your government. And in terms of where after austerity, look, eventually economies do regain at least some of their footing. I would say the longer-term challenge with regard to this economy, the U.S. economy, other advanced economies, is, again, standard of living, wages, as well as jobs. And widening inequality is is very disturbing from the standpoint of sustaining these economies and also sustaining our democracies.
Well, that's great. I think I'm going to invite Kay back up to say a few words.
Well, only very few words, and it's really, Robert, just on behalf of the TUC, to thank you again very warmly indeed for that great lecture. I found it challenging and stimulating, and also rather encouraging, and a great discussion as well. Thanks to you, Faisal, for your questions and your chairing, but also thanks to all the questions from you. I've got quite a few more thanks, so bear with me for a moment. I want to thank the whole TUC team that put this event together, and thank you all again for coming. And I want to encourage you to look at our After Austerity website to see the forthcoming events in this series of seminars and conferences. You're all really welcome to come to those. And then perhaps most importantly, I need to remind you that we have got drinks downstairs, and I hope that you'll join us for a while. But before we all make the trek downstairs, I want to invite you to join with me to give a warm round of applause to thank Robert for coming all the way from California across the Atlantic for your only UK appearance this year. So we're really privileged. Thank you very much.